All right, so in the last app the last time we were working together, we focused on JSON and creating PHP scripts and MySQL databases using a cPanel to create some data that we can host online on the internet. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create an app, an iPad app, that will actually retrieve that data and convert the JSON to dictionaries objects that we can work with and then display them in a split view. So if this is our home page, click on go to split view, we'll have our little character here. We'll have name, address, email, salary, and ID from the database. You click on any one of these, you'll see their details. Right? And so that's the aim. And so this split view is convenient. It's located everywhere. You've seen it all over apps. The idea is that we have our table view on the left-hand side. We have a details view on the right-hand side, so there's no need to click to new pages and whatnot, especially when you have like the full screen capability. So that of an iPad or an iPhone X or an iPhone 6 or 7 Plus, you can take advantage of the high resolution screen there. So what we're going to do is first thing you'll need a couple of images. So even just one image is good enough between here and here, but we're going to put some images, and if not, that's okay. You can just sort of leave a placeholder there. We'll leave a placeholder so that you can utilize images later. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating a new project. And it'll be iOS single view application. And we'll hit next. And I'm going to call this one JSON remote parsing. And it'll be in Swift. And we'll give it a home. All right. So one thing we're going to do is actually organize our files into separate places because there's quite a few files we're going to be working with. So I'm going to create a bunch of groups. So new group will have classes. And we'll have images. We'll have view controllers. And we'll have storyboards. And we'll just move our files into the right places. All right. So for images, if you have images already, you can just add those in. You can pull them from a previous project if you want and just throw them in or just grab them off the internet. All right, so we have our images. And then we're going to add a few new files. We're going to add all our files first. We're going to do our storyboard first before we move into writing some code. So the first thing we want to do is create all these extra files we have that we're going to require. So starting with view controllers, we're going to need 2 new view controllers. So I'll say new file. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a subpage, as you saw, that's a split view, and it'll have a view controller for the table side, and it'll have a view controller for the details half. So we're going to need 2 view controllers. Now the first one for the table, we'll say iOS Cocoa Touch class. And it'll actually be a subclass of UI table view controller, and you can just call it table view controller. Now the UI table view controller differs from view controller in that it actually adds the support methods you need automatically for the table methods to get the table up and running. So in the past exercise we've done together, we've focused on just creating a generic view controller and just created our methods by hand and brought in our interfaces by hand. Well, you can use the table view controller instead if you so chose to do so. So I'm going to call mine table view controller. It'll be the view controller for the left half of that split view screen, and give it a home. I'm going to add one more view controller. So I'm going to say new file. And again, iOS Cocoa Touch class. And this will be just a regular view controller. So subclass of UI view controller, I'm just going to call it details view controller. And we're going to give that a home as well. All right. So we have our view controllers in play. Now we're going to need a couple of objects. One is for our customized cell. So we'll start by adding that in under classes. So we'll say new file, iOS Cocoa Touch class. This will be UI table view cell. And we'll call it my data table view cell. And one more object. This will just be a regular NS object. So iOS Cocoa Touch class. This object is going to handle all of our data transfer, data processing from JSON. So I'm just going to call it get data. All right, so now we have all of our files in play. Let's move over to the storyboard and let's start adding our items to there. So we'll start off with launch screen and just put like a little loading message. Also, we're going to go with a landscape app for this application. So first thing we'll do is instead of saying view as iPhone 7, I'm going to go with iPad Pro 9.7. Orientation's landscape. So now we have our iPad screen there. And let's put a label. It says loading. And then we'll move over to main storyboard. And same thing, we'll do iPad 9.7 landscape. Landscape full screen, that is. Let's put a label here as well. Just our little title label. So call it JSON remote parsing. And we'll add a button. And for the button, we'll just say go to split view. There. Now, we're going to bring in our next page. And instead of bringing in a regular view controller, we're going to look for a split view controller. So the split view controller is a pre-built set of view controllers already configured to work with each other. So it'll save us a lot of headache. So I'm going to bring in a split view controller. Notice that it grows dramatically. And just throw it anywhere. We can move stuff around after. And it adds all these view controllers right away. This one is kind of in the way here of our home page. So there. see where everything is. There we go. So this is a better view of everything laid out. So what we have is we start off with our split view controller, which manages 3 other view controllers. So this is our navigation controller that manages splitting navigation between the table view and the details view. This down here is our details view page, and this over here on the extreme right is our table view page. So all of our stuff goes only into the table side of things, whereas in the details view, all of our stuff only goes in the detail side of things. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to start populating everything. Now, first thing we'll do is create our segue for go to split view to the next page, and we want to create it connecting to the split view itself. So we just want to create a segue to this page in particular. So what we're going to do is control drag to the split view controller. Let's say present modally. So now it'll automatically go there. Now we'll focus our attention on the other two, on the extreme right and extreme bottom 2 view controllers. That's where all of our detail and data is going to go. And you may want to use or take advantage of the document view to help you out with different things as needed, but we'll start with this minimized. And I'm going to start with the details view. We're going to subclass it, change class to details view controller. And since we're at it, we might as well populate it as well. So details view controller is going to have an image. So put a little image view up here. And we'll have 5 labels. And I'll actually populate with what information is supposed to actually go there. So I'll just say name. Go with a 44 font. Now let's copy and paste this 4 more times. Maybe adjust it a little bit. There. So the second one, instead of name, it'll say address. And we'll say email. Say salary. And ID will be at the bottom. Right, and that'll be it for details. So moving over to the table, first thing we'll do is we'll subclass this view controller to our, and notice it's expecting a table view controller, to table view controller, which is what we called our group view controller. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in a customized UI table view cell. So bring in a table view cell. we're going to drag it just inside where it says prototype cells. Actually, no, I'm going to undo that. So what we're going to do actually is take advantage of the existing built-in UI table view cell here. We're going to customize UI table view cell to be our my data table view cell. And switching over to the attributes inspector for that same table view cell, we're going to put in our reuse identifier. We're going to call it my cell. Now be careful how you spell my cell, because whatever you type here needs to be reused in our code. All right? Otherwise it'll cause an easy app crash right there. So we have our reuse identifier set up. Now let's actually configure the cell itself. I'm going to actually stretch it a little bit, because we're going to add a UI image view and a couple of labels. So we have an image view. Shrink it down. Yeah, maybe about that height, width. There. And add a couple of labels. There. So now we have our labels for name and email, and we have our image. All right, so we're done with the storyboard for now. Now all that's left to do is to start writing some code. So we're going to find our way into the My Data table view cell and actually add our items from there. So we'll switch over to My Data table view cell. And let's start by adding in the items we need to connect for that table view cell. So we're going to add a few IB outlets here. Say var my name extends UI label. Var my email UI label. And var my image, call it my logo to be more detailed, UI image view. All right. And so now that we have it, we can go ahead and connect things up in our storyboard. So we have my name, my email, my logo. We'll switch over to main.storyboard. And we'll have to highlight, we'll take advantage of the document view. Click on my cell, and there it is. Remember, this my cell, this is our reuse identifier, so it's overlaid with whatever you put in reuse identifier. So you want to highlight my cell, because that's what we called it, and then you can drag my email. I'll use it for the bottom label. My logo is the image view, and my name. All right, so now for now our storyboard is complete, and we're going to jump over to get data, getData.swift. And with getData, we're going to use it as a object that will interact with the database, download the data, convert it to an array of dictionaries. That's the end game here for this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by defining an array of dictionaries. So we'll say var db data extends and as our dictionary. And then we're going to say let my URL equal. Now you can put your URL from the exercise we did last time, or you could use mine, and mine is this. And be wary of the capitalization in the SQL to JSON.php file name. And we got to say as string. Okay. So those first two variables will support retrieving our data. This third variable we're going to create will support error handling. We're going to create an enum that will define different error messages for if we're running into issues with JSON. And what you want to do is you want to really beef up error handling when you're connecting to a database and connecting to JSON and trying to download data, because anything can go wrong, and quite often it does. So we'll say enum JSON error will extend string comma error. And we'll say case no data equals error no data. We'll say case conversion failed equals error conversion from JSON failed. And that'll be it for now. You can add more error messages as you grow your projects, but for now this is good enough for us. All right. So now that we have our dictionary, array of dictionaries, we have our URL, we have our error messages. Now we're going to create a method to do all of our JSON parsing and error handling. So we're going to create a new func. Say func, and we're going to call it JSON parser. And so the first thing we'll do is we're going to check to see if we can actually connect to our URL. So we'll actually use a guard function, or almost like a reverse if in a way. Guard let endpoint equal URL string passing in my URL, else print. We'll just print. You're going to find that printing to the console is your best friend for debugging JSON. Error creating endpoint or connection. And return. At that point we fail. There's no point in going further. All right. So that's the first step. Let's check to see if we can connect. Otherwise, we can go ahead and create the URL request object. So you're kind of seeing that the URL object's the first step in connecting with a web view to get a web page to appear on the web view. Same idea with doing some HTTP access. So we start with our URL object, and so you may realize that the next step is the URL request object. So we'll say let request equal URL request. passing in URL of endpoint. Now, for a web view, we would have done creating a URL object, passing in our URL, and then we would do a URL request object, and then the next step would have been like web view load request, right? For a web view, well, we have some sort of we have a similar approach here, but we're going to use something different, right? We're going to load the request by using an asynchronous data task. And the reason for that is because we don't want our iPad or device to hang and freeze while it's going back and trying to download the new data, right? We want the user to be able to do other stuff while we're waiting. So to do that, we're going to say URL session dot shared dot data task with request. And we'll add a piece of block code here. And our block code arguments will be data, comma, response, comma, error, with a lowercase e, in, we'll leave some space open here. And so now, we'll start with trying to retrieve our data. So at this point, we've made the request through the data task line. What happens is when our request comes back, our data comes back from the server, it's going to execute the code in between these curly brackets, right, up to this closing curly. And so now we have to determine whether data was actually received. First thing we'll do for debugging purposes is try and print out our data to the console just to verify we actually got data. It's useful for if you, if you're debugging and maybe you have a 404 not found, or maybe there's some garbage data in your data return back. You want to see what's there. So this next line is not necessary, but it's useful for debugging purposes. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the data, so the little argument data here, and convert it into a string to print to the console. So we're going to say let data string equal ns string, passing in data, should let autocomplete. So we want the data and encoding. So first data will just be data with exclamation mark. Encoding will be string dot encoding dot utf-8 dot raw value. And then we'll just print it to the console. We'll say print data string with an exclamation mark. So now that we printed to the screen, assuming everything's all great, let's first of all verify that there was actually data returned and it wasn't empty. So we can do that with another guard statement. So we'll say guard let, this is kind of a weird one, we'll say guard let data equal data, just to return a true or a false, else throw a JSON, sorry, not a, but JSON error.no data. Now this is just going to check to see if no data was returned. Maybe the data, there legitimately could be no data there, and for that we should actually be doing some better handling by adding to our table saying no data was available, as a default message, or maybe we lost connection halfway through, right? Maybe before they're about to send data back, they sent nothing, right? Anything can go wrong, right? So we wanted to test to see if there's actually data, right? So we'll return a true or a false here. So we're just testing for data. Now, what we're going to try and do is try and convert, at this point we have data, we want to try and convert it from JSON to an array of dictionaries. So we're going to run our JSON serialization line by saying guard let JSON equal, and then try JSON serialization dot JSON object. All right. So with our data that was passed in, our options, we'll just keep it as an empty array. We'll say as NS dictionary. Well, really an array of NS dictionaries. See, the reason for the array of dictionaries is because we have multiple rows of data in the table. So each row represents an index in the array, and because we have multiple columns in the table, each column can best be classified as a dictionary through a key value pair. So that's why we're using an array of dictionaries here for our data. And we'll say else. We're going to throw the JSON error dot conversion failed error message. And then here, to go a little further, what we're going to do is we're going to print our JSON. And what we can do now is, and don't mind the underlining, we'll fix that in a moment, but we'll save our JSON here. So we'll say self.db_data is equal to JSON. And because we threw a try, we have to throw some catches. So we'll catch let error as JSON error. We'll just print out, print error dot raw value, just to print to the console. We'll do another catch. Let error as NS error. We'll print error dot debug description. And finally, down here we're going to say dot resume. All right, to fix my errors, first I'm going to put do. This is actually a do statement. And then the other mistake I made was that I passed in data string. So let's fix that. There, we can try quick Command B. And it looks like build succeeded, so everything's happy again. So just to recap what's here, we're running an async task, data task, and within the curlies, this is our block code that's going to execute upon receiving successful data from the database. And what we have to do is parse that data to see if it's what we're looking for. So first step, and this is a debug approach, is just to verify that we actually got data. So we're going to take our data, convert it to a string, and we're going to print it to the console. So we'll verify first that we got data. Then we'll check to see if this data actually if there's actually data or if it was just empty, because it could just return back like empty information to the console. We will not notice it. We won't catch it. So we want to just check to see if data actually exists and otherwise throw a no data error that we created above, which, just to recap, is actually error no data. That message would appear in the console. All right. Then the next step is to try and convert that data from treating it as JSON into an array of NS dictionaries. If it's proper JSON, it'll actually easily convert into an array of NS dictionaries, and so we'll actually end up with data called JSON. Right? If that doesn't work, then it'll throw a error conversion failed error message to the console. And for more debugging, we're going to print out the JSON data to a console as well, and then we will save it in our db data variable. We have some catch statements just to print out additional debug data for us. So print out the raw value, print out the debug description, assuming all of this actually hit. Now we end off with a dot resume because that's basically saying that this is that's part of the statement of the shared data task. So it's actually one giant line of code right? Starting at data task. It's actually data task dot resume, right? But between the curly brackets is our actual data task that we're going to execute upon successful completion. All right, so now that we have our get data in place, let's move over to our table view controller and populate our table and see what we can do there. So now, the thing about the table itself is that upon loading, it will make its request to the database, download the data, and display the data in the table. But the problem is, it will just load the table with or without data. It may even crash. So we need to have a way to repeatedly check the table to see when the data is available, and then reload the table when the data is ready. So we're going to add extra code. There's a few different ways to do it. This is just one of many different ways. To do that, we're going to use a timer. And we're just going to refresh the table once the timer finds that there is data in the array. So first thing we're going to do is define our get data object. So we'll say let get data equal get data. Then we're going to define a timer object. Var timer extends timer. And then we create an IB outlet. Var, and we'll say my table extends UI table of view. All right. So we're going to find that viewdid load is not sufficient for our application here. We want to reach into the database as soon as possible. So we're going to actually invoke the view will appear method. All right. So I'm going to create view will appear. So I'm going to say override func view will appear. And we'll call super view will appear, passing in animated. Now we're going to invoke our timer here, and then we'll invoke our JSON parser. So what we're going to do is we're going to say self.timer is equal to timer.scheduled timer. There's a few of these instances. What we want is the one that will allow us to just call another method. Right? Which is this, because it has the selector argument. So we're going to create another method below, which is our selector. We're going to replace this selector call with the name of our method. Right? So what we'll do first of all is just fill this out. We won't finish it. Right? For a timer interval, I'm just going to hard code it to like 0.4 seconds. So every 0.4 seconds, we're going to poll and see if our data is ready to populate the table with. The target will be self. I'm going to skip selector and leave it like that. User info will be nil. We don't care about user info. And repeats will say true. We want it to repeat over and over again until our data is ready, and then we can invalidate the timer later. And we're going to call getData.json parser. So now it's going onto the web. It's getting the data from the database. It's downloading the data in the meantime. So now what we should do is complete the line above, our selector. So the question now is, what do we want to execute every 0.4 seconds? Well, we're going to create that method now. So below, I'm going to create a new method, func, called refresh table. Now, for those of you using Swift 4 or have the latest, you're going to find that this will create an error. So we're going to have to say objc. This will actually clear out that error. So we'll put it in anyway because it doesn't cause any issues for Swift 3. All right, so this is to make it compatible with the selector call here. It's just extra code. So what we're going to do inside refresh table is just check to see if the length of the array for db data is greater than 0. If it is, then at that point we realize, yes, we have data that we can populate the table with. So we're just going to say if get data dot db data dot count is greater than 0. We're going to put it all inside its own set of round brackets. All right. Now, at this point, if there is data, that means we can, reload the table and invalidate the timer. So we'll say self.myTable.reload data and self.timer invalidate. So now that we have our refresh table, we'll replace the selector argument with hashtag or #, depending on what generation you're from. We'll say self.refresh table. So now that line is complete. So that selector call basically allows us to invoke the selector. So now at this point, we're actually retrieving data from the database. What we need to do now is actually populate our table. So because the UI table view controller auto-generates a lot of the code that we typically had to manually create, we can go ahead and add that in now. So scrolling down a little bit further, we have here number of sections. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the warning. And instead of 0, we actually have one table or one section of a table. So I'm going to change that to 1. The number of rows in section. Now, this is kind of weird because for a while we will actually have no rows. We'll have no data. So we'll have to keep the return 0. But when we do get data, we'll actually have rows there. So we'll actually say if get data dot db data does not equal nil, then we'll return get data dot db data dot count. Else return 0. So that'll be our number of rows in section. Because for a little period, we're going to have no data, so we want to return 0, so it doesn't cause a crash. Once we get data, well, it'll be number of rows that we actually hit. You'll notice below that self-row index path is commented out. Well, we need it. So we need to uncomment self-row index path. And this is probably just to prevent crashes from happening in the app if you just happen to add the split view and are not ready to test it out yet, or you need to test it out and you're not ready to populate data. All right, so we'll say let cell equal tableview.dequeryable_cell with identifier. Well, in the storyboard, we called the reuse identifier myCell. Now be careful, if you called it something else, you want to make sure that myCell is spelled, or whatever you called it is spelled exactly how you want it. This is how I called it in my storyboard. Now, remember, this is a long-winded line of code, so what we're going to do is say as my data table view cell, and if this happens to fail, we're going to use a double question mark as our optional to invoke a brand new my data table view cell. So we'll say my data table view cell, passing in style being dot default, reuse identifier my cell. All right, so at this point, either way we have a cell. Either we're instantiating a brand new cell or we're bringing a cell from a cell that's left the screen. Now we're going to populate everything from our array of dictionaries. So we're going to configure the cell first by getting the row number we're dealing with. We'll say let row equal index path dot row, and then we'll say let row data equal get data dot db data of row as ns dictionary. Now we can go ahead and populate the data. We can go ahead and say cell dot my logo dot image. Well, I'm going to hard code this to one of my images. So I'm going to say equals UI image named, and I'm going to use donkey.png. All right, so I'm reusing my graphics from my game app from earlier. And I'll populate name and email. So we'll say cell.myname.text equals row data of name. Now be careful of this information here. This should line up, the information here in the quotes should line up with your column name for name, right? If it's different, if you had used a lowercase n, then use a lowercase n, but make sure it lines up with the column name you created in your MySQL database. All right, so I'm going to say row data of name as string. And then cell.myEmail.text is equal to row data of email as string. And we'll just return cell. All right, second last step is we're going to connect our myTable variable. I'm going to connect it to the table view. All right, but if you try running it right now, it will give you no data. It might even crash because I'm using an HTTP URL, not an HTTPS URL. So we have to open up that ability to go and be able to view non-HTTP websites, and of course that's a security. Now we'll switch over to info.plist. And we'll add a new line. So mousing over information property list, hitting the plus sign. We're going to type in app transport. Remember to capitalize A and capitalize the T for app transport, but you can autocomplete app transport security settings. Now there's a subsetting we want to bring in, but because it's very finicky, we actually have to hit the arrow, make sure the arrow is pointing down, and then you can hit the plus sign under app transport security settings. And we'll say allow arbitrary loads. I mean, to be really safe, you'd use exception domains, but for this exercise, is good enough. And we'll change this no to a yes. And now you can run this. So I'm going to choose an iPad 9.7 Pro and give it a run. Just do a rotate to port to landscape, that is. And there we go. We have all of our items, but clicking on it does nothing. So far, we're able to retrieve all of our data from the database. Now the next step is you'll click on any one of these and get our data to populate here in this page. All right, so now we're going to finish this off. What we're going to do is we're going to switch over to details_viewController.swift. We're going to configure this view controller. All right, so we had a bunch of labels. We're going to actually create those outlets right now. And so we'll start with a IB outlet. I'm going to say var lbl name extends UI label. And I'll say IB outlet var lbl address extends UI label. IB outlet var lbl email extends UI label. IB outlet var lbl salary extends UI label. IB outlet var lbl id extends UI label. All right, now the trick here is that we're going to have data in one view controller. We want to pass it into another view controller. In particular, we want to pass in at least the row number, but we'll pass in the entire getData variable. So what we want to do is we're going to create a new variable, a new method to just retrieve the information. It'll be a generic method. And so I call this method, so func update person. Now actually the arguments passed in, first argument passed in will be getData, extended by getData. Second one is select. We'll call it select, extending an int. All right. So the first thing we do is pass an entire getData object. I mean, we could really just pass in the dictionary. That'd be good enough as well. And what we're going to do is retrieve the row number from the array of dictionary. So we'll say let row data equal getData.dbData of select as NS dictionary. Now we'll just populate our labels, because at this point we have the object in question. All right. So we'll say self.lblname.text equals row data of name. As string. Now the same for LBL address, row data of address as string. We got LBL email. We got LBL salary. LBL ID. All right, so now we're basically done with details view controller. We got all the information we need. Now we're going to switch back to our table view controller for one last method. So looking at our methods, we have number of sections, number of rows in section, self row index path. We need to bring in a did select row index path, and it's not here. So we'll actually have to type in did select row at index path. So now the trick is, how are we going to pass the data from here to the other one, the details view controller? So what we're going to try and do is try and retrieve the view controller details view controller. So we're going to say if let split equal self.splitvviewController. So assuming it's not nil, we'll try and grab our controller. So we'll say let controllers equal split.viewControllers. So we got the whole list of view controllers. Now we'll say let details view controller, and I'm calling it with the details with lowercase d, equal controllers, which is an array of the view controllers we have. So controllers dot count minus 1. It's actually the last item in the array, because it's like the last view controller we're dealing with. As details view controller, and then we'll just call details with lowercase d view controller dot update person, passing in get data, and index path dot row is our second argument. So this array only has two items because it's actually the split view controller retrieving from. The split view controller has the table, so that's view controller 0, and it has the details, which is view controller 1, or basically it's the second view controller, the last view controller, so it's actually count minus 1. So that's how you can reason this array of controllers.count minus 1. Convert to details view controller, call update person. The method we just created, passing in get data, passing in index path.row. Now we have our proper get data object. We can just retrieve the item in the array and populate our items in the details pane. Now all that's left is to go back to our storyboard, connect things up, give it a run, and we should see everything up and running. So now we can configure the details. I'm going to hard code that image to be my monkey. Of course, you can expand it by having different avatars for each character, but I won't do that. So let's connect everything up. So LBL address, email, ID, name, salary, and give it a run. All right, so there's our items. Starts off with a generic name, address, email, salary. Click on each, and you have all of your data appear. All right. So to summarize, the app we built today was a continuation of the last exercise we talked about, where we built a database with some PHP scripts. We used the cPanel to access that for shared hosting, assuming you're using a cPanel there. And now today we created an iPad app with a split view, where on the left-hand side we would actually have the items from our PHP script, our JSON objects passed in remotely, and we just put name and email here, and then we click on every cell, we have our full details here. So we covered here were split view controllers, NSJSON, we covered being able to navigate the table view controller, amongst other things.